the topic of this morning's platform, and I'm honored to be introducing our speaker. Our speaker, Jason Haber, he epitomizes both the value and the power of social engagement, if you don't mind me saying so.
Thank you,
Unrehearsed. His extensive career has intersected the worlds of real estate, politics, academia, and publishing. He is currently an elected official in the Democratic Party, where he serves as district leader and as a member of the state committee. This is not in the bio, but I discovered by going back through our archives that 3 years ago he addressed this society on The Business of Good, which was the title of what became, for a while, the bestseller. Last year he launched a podcast on urbanism called Future City. And this is the title of this morning's talk. In full, Future City, a look at the past, present, and future of New York City and cities around the world. Welcome back, Jason Haber.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming out today. It's funny, every time I come here, this is my third time now speaking here. So I think on Saturday Night Live, you get a special honor when it's your 5th time. So I'm hoping to make the 5 Timers Club if you'll keep having me back. So thank you. And every time I do come here, right before I speak, we're now 3 for 3, there's always this technical glitch that occurs. I swear it's the ghost of Robert Moses every time coming down. He knows something's brewing, so we'll hopefully get through this. We'll see if we can get beyond it. I think you can kill the center light there so they can see the perfect. Thank you. So we're going to talk today about the future of cities, but before we move forward, I think it's important to take a look back. You know, cities, I like to think of them, were like the internet before there was an internet. You needed them for everything, for any commerce, for trade, for communication, for community. Before there was a time of cell phones and social media, for those young enough to remember, cities provided everything. And in fact, there once was a time when you actually did need walls outside of a city. Not so much today, though. Over time, though, cities took on this really interesting shape. Throughout the course of human history, most people lived in rural communities. Cities were not the dominant force that they are today. By 1954, you can see that the shift begins to occur where we're moving humanity towards cities, but only until 1954. Before that, we're basically living, for the course of human history, in a rural environment. And of course, today you can see how that's further evolved. And as I look on the map here, Larry and I were talking earlier, just a show of hands, how many people know where Ukraine is on the map? Very good. Very good. We both looked at that before, too. An amazing thing, isn't it? But as this is happening, so for the last 10,000 years of history, we're largely in rural areas, and now we're moving into this urban environment. And on the one hand, cities have never been more important because now they house the majority of humanity. But on the other hand, they've never been so dangerous, for they're contributing to our very own peril. But in that, there's also an opportunity. Well, first of all, I want to look at, where did cities go wrong? Where did we begin this descent into climate hell that we now find ourselves in? By the way, I'm delighted it's 45 degrees out, that I didn't need a jacket when I walked here today. If it was one day, that's one thing. That's not climate, that's weather. The president doesn't understand the difference between the two. You guys do. But when it's consistently like this, and when the planet is aflame in Australia and elsewhere, we know that something's wrong. But cities are contributing to it, and the decisions that we've made about how we plan for cities are a big part of that. So I want to begin our story back in 1939. So 1939, this is a picture from the World's Fair. Over 44 million people attended that fair. And what was its most popular exhibit? It was called Futurama. And in it, the auto industry, which sponsored it, wanted to give city dwellers a peek of the future. And inside, they got it. An 8-lane highway, symmetrical shaped buildings. It was free of congestion. It was free of traffic. And if you look very, very carefully, it was also free of people. The planners didn't bother to account for people who would be living in this supposed future of ours. Unfortunately, it would be a sign of things to come, because at the end of World War II, we actually ended up weaponizing our roads in the battle of ideas that became the Cold War, and nothing symbolized our battle in the Cold War like the car. The car, during the Cold War, was a very symbol of democracy. I can go wherever I want to go. I don't need the Soviet-style train. I have freedom. I don't need to rely on anyone else. And if that's the case, it means that we're going to put the car above all other forms of transportation. And in that, what I call cardocracy, where the car is this very form of democracy and of freedom, it means that we're going to spend our money and our time building up roads and highways. And what happens when there's more traffic, when traffic approaches? Well, we need more roads, so we build more cars. We have more cars, we need more roads. This is the treadmill that we're on in the 20th century. And you can see where this is going. But the roads that were built were everywhere, whether they were on the blank canvases of Long Island or the densest city in the world. And by the time we asked if this was the right thing to do, it was largely too late, because cardocracy had taken hold in America. Choked in traffic, no one seemed to notice that our experiment in cardocracy had failed. But no one else noticed something else, that our experiment in democracy had failed too. Earlier I said they built roads, they built highways, but in reality, there was no they. And if you were at my last lecture here, you know that there was only he. Now, you're booing, now the thing's gonna cut out, watch. When we think of corruption, we normally think, at least in today, the currency of corruption is money. But with Robert Moses, the currency is power itself. And that's what the Moses story teaches us. And he comes to power just at this right moment when cardocracy was on the rise, and he was the perfect man to promulgate it. In my last lecture here, we talked about his rise to power and what he did with that power. And if you have other questions on that, I'll be happy to take them later. Obviously, we could do a whole talk on Moses. But these are just 52 of the many projects that he did. 400 miles of roads, over 600 playgrounds, $150 billion in today's money were spent on roads, for cars, for people not living in a city, but largely passing through it. And if you look at his titles that he held, it reads like a movie script at the end, I know, like movie credits. He holds 12 positions at the same time. They're all appointed. Some come from the city, some come from the state. Most egregiously, as Parks Commissioner and Construction Coordinator, he proposes public works, and then as the leading member of the City Planning Commission, he approves what he proposed. And yes, that was the 20th century in New York. 5 mayors, 6 governors, and 7 presidents over his 44 years in power. A legacy of time that has no equal in this country. Now, when we think about New York in the post-war era, a lot of people say that this is the photo that defines where the city was at the end of World War II. Because, you know, New York's not a capital, right? Like, if you think about the great cities of the world, they're all capital cities. Berlin's a capital, London's a capital, Paris a capital, Tokyo's a capital. We're not even the capital of our own state, let alone the capital of the nation. Well, we should be, but and so instead, New York becomes the sort of capital of the world. But I think in the post-war years, there's another photo that much, much better sums up where we were going as a city and where we were thinking and what the direction we were going in, and that's this. I think this picture encapsulates everything you need to know about how we plan for a city. You can see the encroachment here of the Cross Bronx Expressway literally going through what was a community right there. And if this is the photo that defines a city, what happens as a result of planning like this? Well, this is what happens. In the 1970s, President Carter came to Charlotte Street in the Bronx. Charlotte Street became so blighted that they removed it from the city maps. and this is President Carter touring it. Of course, there were the Fear City advertisements. Stay off the streets after 6 p.m. Do not walk. And these were circulated in Midtown Manhattan at the time of the City of Fear. Now, maybe more importantly, if we're funding roads, if we're funding for cars, it means we're losing something else. And in this case, we lost some things that were pretty special. It's hard to explain to people who were never there or don't understand what Penn Station was and what it meant to the city. Ada Louise Huxtable, writing in the New York Times, wrote, "We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed." And so maybe all the roads aren't as important as what we built as when we consider what was lost. Because if you lose the soul of the city, does it matter how many roads that you really do build? But the problem is, as we think about the future, it's important, and I always start here, because the lessons of the past remind us if we're not cognizant of them, we can stumble into them again, and I greatly fear we're about to do that. Now, when I originally wrote this presentation, this slide, to be fair, wasn't in there. And then 2 weeks ago, the governor gave his State of the State address. And in that address, he cited 3 people in his administration as the next Robert Moseses. His words. So people forget when you say someone's the next Robert Moses and you mean it as a compliment. That is not a compliment. When he was governor, Eliot Spitzer said, at least he got things done. The problem is we're so enamored by the might of construction that we rarely think about the right of construction. And what happened with all those dollars spent? 1940, this was the population of New York, 7.4 million people. In 1980, it's 7 million people. The reason I use this slide is, over 400 years of history in New York, there is not one 4-year period where the population declined. Ever. Go back to the censuses of 1660 and look. 40 years, wars, famines, plagues, flu breakouts. It doesn't matter. During the Civil War, the population always goes up, except for when Robert Moses was in power. And so, for that reason, I wrote this op-ed calling for Robert Moses' name to be removed from all roads and buildings and structures in New York State that bear his name. And I did it not because he was racist, but because he was, well, Robert Moses. Now, luckily, legislature did pick up the bill, and it's now making its way through the legislature. We'll see what happens with that. But he wants to rename it as Jane Jacobs Park. Jane Jacobs is probably the hero in our story of the 20th century. Born in Scranton, she moves here to New York. Misogyny follows her career throughout it. Oftentimes we hear the phrase Jane Jacobs, housewife. To say she was a housewife sort of denies her writing career. Of course, she writes the great book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she looks at the ballet that is the city street. And she talks about the things that are important living in a city, not just passing through it, and gets people to think about things differently, and she starts to fight back against Robert Moses. We talked about this in my last lecture. 2 quick slides I want to show of things she defeated. Something you've never seen, the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have eliminated Soho. If you imagine an 8-lane highway running through Lower Manhattan. And of course, the Mid-Manhattan Expressway. At one point in time, they proposed running the Mid-Manhattan Expressway through the Empire State Building. Can you imagine the security risk of running a highway through the... But this was seriously considered. And of course, this never happened. But Robert Moses called his construction program the Arterial Road Program. And that got me thinking about the word artery. What is an artery? An artery takes lifeblood away from the heart. Good planning, thinking about the future of cities, isn't about planning for arteries. It's about planning for veins that bring life in to the city. I want to give you a very quick example of that. In 1820, there were 123,000 people living in New York. And then DeWitt Clinton came along and proposed the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal would link our waterways, the Hudson, across the state, linking us to the Great Lakes and the great rivers of the Midwest, connecting New York commercially. Cost $7.1 million to build. He gets thrown out of office because it's so unpopular. They actually name it after him. They call it Clinton's Ditch. And yet, it made its money back before it officially opened. It was so successful. Why was it so successful? What cost $125 per day now costs just $6. And the time that it took to ship goods goes from 45 days to 9. So there's this explosion of commerce within the city. So we invested properly, and the city grew and exploded. And then by 1860, just 40 years later, again, using that same example, the population of New York is 10 times greater. That's when planning works. What can a city survive, and what leads to its fall? Jane Jacobs told us it's not war that will destroy a city, any city. It's not drugs that will destroy a city. It's not the environment yet. We're going to get to that, though. It's on its way. But the most pernicious of all has been the automobile. Now, under our current mayor, and this may surprise some or not surprise some, car ownership is actually higher now than it was 6 years ago. And subway transportation is now declining. We've seen an 8% decline since 2015. What we need to start talking about is transportation alternatives to the point where they don't become the alternative, they become the norm. That's what I'd like to see. And we need more thinking about that. It's almost as if we were born, I saw this picture here. I just found it amusing that one of the alternatives was walking. As if we were born with a carburetor and not 2 feet. This is what we have to start reframing the conversation. Not only are all these far better ways of getting around than the automobile, they all help us on the next part we're going to talk about, which is saving the environment and saving the planet. I also want to look back because there haven't been that many innovations in our streets over the last 400 years or so. As I see it, there have been 3 phases of streetscape here in New York and in most cities. And what we're now looking at is the 4th. The first one would be what I call the tradesman's street. The tradesman's street is best defined by Stone Street. There were natural topographies that streets had to fit in. Manhattan had hills, it had tributaries, and you went around them, but the streets were designed for commerce and for trade. Here's a good look on the east side, and you can see how streets were just sort of meandering around. And there was not a sense of order to it. That order comes in iteration 2, which is the gridiron. Gridiron isn't anything new. Grids in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia came before our grid. The difference was the New York grid would bow to nothing. The New York grid was so audacious at the time that you could fit the entire population of the United States into Manhattan. Of course, it's missing Central Park, which is the big omission, but that would come about 45 years later. But the grid sets us up for the success of the future. Here's a picture of, in the Manhattan Borough President's Office, the original grid. And since we're on the Upper West Side, here's a picture of the grid taking form. That's the Museum of Natural History up there. That's 77, 76, and 75th Streets between Central Park West and Columbus. Pretty cool. And then I also like this is on 42nd and 2nd. The city required property owners to bring their buildings down to grade. And so in the mornings on this building on the right there, there would be huge lines at Starbucks for people getting their coffee on those steps. It was very hazardous. No, it wasn't a Starbucks. It was a Duane Reade. So our third iteration are the streets of Robert Moses, which are defined by the highway passing through the city. People have asked me if I could sum up Robert Moses in one word after seeing these images, what would it be? And I tell everyone New York needed a Robert Moses, but instead we got the Robert Moses. And the city of the streets, right, used to be part of the life, is something that we've lost. And now looking forward, the streets have not changed that much. But now we have an opportunity, I think, to recast their entire fabric, to have a whole new conversation about it. But we have to make some things clear, because a lot of people say Jane Jacobs was right. I don't know anyone that disagrees with that, but it's another thing to say that Jane Jacobs has won. I took this photo in Central. You can tell I took this photo because it's a little crooked, but I took this photo in Central Park. the building on the left, which casts shadows in Central Park, houses 60 apartments. The one on the right, about 170. And we're planning for, who are we building for in this city of the future? You know, I showed you an earlier photo of Futurama from 1939, and certainly this wouldn't come to pass, right? I mean, certainly no one would build a scale model with big symmetrical buildings on either side of a road without any people on it, right? And then, over the summer, I went to Hudson Yards. Kind of reminded me of something. Also, no people were in their model, which I think people are supposed to buy the apartments there, but we'll see. So, there are some rules here that I think going forward is a planning principle. Streets must serve those who live in the city, not those who pass through it. The street has to be a catalyst to promote wellness and sustainability, and the street should move the most amount of people in the most efficient way possible. We have about 200 people in this room today. I want to show you a quick experiment. If you all were a car, you would be about 10 city blocks of cars or so. If we were to put you on a bus, you would fit on about 2 buses. Seated. On a New York City bus, we get you all in. I want to show you the same picture if you were all on bicycles. The lesson here about cars is that you're not sitting in the traffic, you are the traffic. That the cars are promoting the traffic. And every time we try to make a change, there's always this big whiplash against it, but I want to show you a good example of something that works. If you've seen 14th Street before and after the busway, I was down there. I met with people. They were very angry that the busway was coming because of the concerns that they had about chaos on the streets. Absolute chaos. There would still be cars. There would be traffic. It would be a disaster. And then I took this photo 3 days after it opened, and that's in the middle of the day. If you haven't been there to experience what happens, see, the thing is like this. In the 20th century, we learned if you make it more easy for people to have cars by building more roads and more highways, they will buy more cars, and they will use their cars because you're making it easier for them. Conversely, the opposite is also true. If you make it more difficult for folks, they will be pushed to other forms of transportation. People don't like breaking habits, but once they break a habit and they see there's another way of getting about, they find the benefits of it. You know, we have bike lanes, obviously, throughout the city, and I'm an avid biker. I use them all the time. But, you know, there are problems with the way we do our bikes. Bikes and cars just are a bad combination. But it doesn't mean they have to be a bad combination. We want to get to Vision Zero, in not just this city, but in any city. Let's look at Central Park West, for example. There are a couple of things we could do that, now we get to the phase of this conversation. I'm going to propose some ideas. Some will seem a little crazy, but just go with me for a minute, and then we can have a conversation about it. Let's be a little visionary here for a minute. Let's extend the sidewalk out. Let's go to Central Park West and regrade so bikes are not on the same grade as cars. You could take Central Park West, which for some reason is a 2-lane road. You could make it a 1-lane road going north with 2 lanes of bicycles going north and south. You'd still have that parking on the, on the west side of the street. I would ring with trees. Not just trees, but there's a certain type of greenery that grows very well here in New York. Anyone know what it is? No, someone said marijuana? No, apple trees. I would put apple trees all over this boulevard and let people pick fresh fruit right off the tree. I know that sounds foreign, but apple trees grow really well here, as do fig trees, as do other trees. And imagine in underserved communities where they don't have access to fresh fruit, where they could just walk on the street or bicycle and pick their own fruit from their own tree. And believe it or not, we used to do this in New York. We used to produce our own vegetables here. For some reason, it's become so foreign. But if we're going to redesign the street, I say, let's really redesign the street. Let's make it sustainable. Let's make it safe. Let's make it healthy. And we can do this. I just picked Central Park West because, frankly, we're on Central Park West. But we could do this all over the city. We could get to Vision Zero, completely eliminate the risk to bicyclists, and at the same time, create a more healthy environment for everyone in the city. Speaking of cars, I would do some other things too. We right now have an idling system. I want to talk about alternate side first. So when you park your car and you're waiting for the street sweeper to come through, people just sit there. They're not supposed to idle, but they do because they get cold, and you have to wait an hour and a half. If you sat in your cars during this dance or ballet, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I believe the second that that street sweeper comes through, you should have the ability to get out of your car and turn it off and stop burning fossil fuels. That would save a lot of CO2 emissions in the city right there. I also think that the street parking should be for people who live here, not people who are passing through here. That's a big change. You know, other cities, they have residentially zoned parking. What would that mean for here? Well, if you lived in this community board, you could park on the side streets for free. If you don't, you gotta pay. Make parking for people who live here if they choose to have cars here. Otherwise, I just don't see the point of the system we're in right now. In terms of our buildings, this is an example of our first 100% electric office building. It's going up in Flatbush, Brooklyn right now, which I think is a great concept. Doesn't use anything on the power grid. It produces its own energy, at least it's supposed to in theory. And I think those are the kinds of things we need to start thinking about, because we have to start being sustainable, which means plastic. We have to talk about. In 2050, there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish. We're not going to be able to eat fish in the distant, not so distant future, because we'll be eating plastic. People don't seem to understand the immense danger that plastic is causing our cities and our communities around the world. And so, by reducing our use of plastics here in the city, we'll make a great impact. I showed this email here, I blanked out who it was to, but 10 years ago I wrote an email to a senior member of the city council urging them to ban plastic bags or to put a plastic bag tax in place. And now 10 years later we have a tax coming starting March 1st. So it took them about 10 years to catch up, but they're getting there. Then recently I sent another email to a city council member telling them we have to ban plastic bottles in Central Park. We'll see if maybe in 2029 I'll come back and maybe that'll happen by then. But I want to show you this. During World War II, we marshaled our energy, and we did it. We produced 200 million pounds of vegetables in New York City. They called them victory gardens. They sprang up all over New York. And the minute the war ended, we stopped. We stopped because the crisis was over, but little did we know the crisis was only just getting started. If we can marshal our energies to defeat the Nazis and be sustainable, certainly now in the face of climate change, we can do that as well. And that is the challenge for our city now, to think bigger about things like urban farms, to stop disenthralling ourselves with the idea that it's been done now and we do things a certain way and we can't do them differently in the future, because we can and because it's the only way forward for us. An economist just recently wrote, "Agriculture and forestry in a city answer a variety of urban development goals beyond green infrastructure, food, and social inclusion, but they help fight climate change, alleviate poverty, urban water management, and opportunities to produce and reuse urban waste." These are things that we can do. I want to take you back to that picture of Jimmy Carter. Again, this is in the 1970s on Charlotte Street. I want to show you something remarkable. This is Charlotte Street today. Cities can regenerate, they can grow, and they can change in ways we don't even think today is possible. People say that New York City is an urban jungle and that the fourth iteration of what I'm proposing is moving us forward, but I don't think of it that way. I actually think the opposite. I think it's moving us back to the beginning, to the unspoiled New York of 1609, to be responsible stewards of the land and to rise up to the challenge of our time. "We shall not cease from exploration," T.S. Eliot once wrote, "and at the end of our exploring will be to arrive at where we started and know the place for the first time." Welcome back to New York. Thank you.
Building in New York, is there maybe this overcapacity will result in catastrophic real estate collapse?
No, so it depends what you build, right? So if you're building for billionaires, yes, you will, but not if you're building for a different kind of housing. So there's always the addability. Yeah?
Why are these buildings not built with solar panels? get rid of plastic bedpans from all the hospitals and go back to stainless steel that can be autoclaved.
So I'll take both questions. So the first one is the code doesn't require them to have solar panels. It's not required in the commercial code of office buildings. I
I don't hear well if you can speak.
maybe someone can. It's not required in the commercial code that they have solar panels. I mean, frankly, in the Northeast, solar panels are part of the answer, but the photovoltaic power of solar here is more limited than it is in, say, the Southwest. There are other things we could do, like wind turbines and other forms of energy too, but it would help. And then on the hospitals and healthcare, so healthcare and wellness it's a different conversation, but yes, obviously we should be moving away from plastic in hospitals and schools and everywhere. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So the plastic bag ban is something very interesting. I'm glad it's passing. Are you aware of the fact that the DEC is suggesting that 10-millimeter thick plastic bags could be given out in lieu of disposable bags in the wish that people would use them? And there's a hearing on this I think on the 27th here in New York. But it's just a question that what you said about the fish and the bags
Right.
and plastic is so true, but we're really almost kicking ourselves in the ass.
Yeah, no, actually, it's exactly right. If you just force people to do something a different way, they get over it and they adapt. If you give them an out, they take the out. And so that would be a huge, huge blunder. Yeah.
Thanks for coming and talking with us, Jason. I'm a longtime member of Transportation Alternatives, veteran cyclist, and I'll just attest, especially as like age, that getting on a bicycle and getting around the city really give you a sense of agency, give you even a sense of hope. So, I guess I'm just wondering, have you read other writers' works kind of on this subject, like Sam Schwartz?
Yeah.
Charles Montgomery, Happy City. Who else? Jeff Speck, Walkable City, even Kunstler's classic, The Geography of Nowhere. I mean, all of these kind of address urban change and how we can make things better.
Yeah, and there was just an 80-page report that I read. It was a flip book of all the different cities, what they're doing all over the world. I mean, a lot of good things in like Copenhagen and some other European cities that are doing on this that we can adapt here. In fact, that's where they're growing trees in I think it's in Copenhagen right now.
Great, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
How would you deal with the problem of the fact that almost everything that's delivered into the city is brought by trucks?
Yep.
And, in the old days, there used to be railroad lines coming right into the city, but most of those were done away with. One was made into the High Line, which
Yep.
everybody seems to love, but it would have been better as a railroad line. And, what, do we have to build massive conveyor belts underground? Because I think Jeff Bezos' idea of drone delivery is never going to work in New York City.
No, I certainly don't think it would work in Manhattan, but who knows what innovation would come in the future. But for now, Jerry Nadler's proposed freight tunnel, of course, would be the best solution because that would also be the least footprint on the environment. So that's one good solution. You have to deal with the trucks, or you have to require that the trucking industry convert to electric vehicles. That would help too. And they have the resources to do it. They just have to be forced to do it. Usually I would do it through taxes.
So as you pointed out, there's some dangers to the community of building a city that makes it so we can drive cars that's built around cities as opposed to people. For the individual that has the car and likes to be able to drive their car, maybe doesn't have some of the sensibilities of people in this room. Aside from legislation, how do you make this attractive? How do you make that kind of building and construction attractive for the individual?
Right. So actually, this is a conversation we have in our own house. My wife's here. We have a car as well. And what I say is, if you want to push people to other alternatives to make it attractive to them. So that will help. The second thing is, it's not about saying that the car is necessarily like the be-all end-all enemy. Of course it isn't, right? You should be shamed if you're in a vehicle, but you should be pushed and promoted to using other forms of transportation. Like if bike lanes were safer with our daughter, we would use more bike lanes. right? If there were less, if the roads were less congested, it would also help when you do want to drive a car, you'd be in less traffic. I think it's part of a larger conversation, and it's important to have.
Could we ever get to a point where we are taxing car drivers enough to make public transportation cheaper?
Well, congestion pricing is going to be the first tax. So it'll be interesting to see how that impacts cars. I think congestion pricing is a good thing. I know it's controversial, but I think it's needed. I think that will greatly reduce people coming in, commuters coming in every day. I think taxes can help get us. Taxes are a great way to change people's behavior. It always works, whether it's a plastic bag or a vehicle or a donut, whatever it is. Taxes will work to change behavior, and it's one of the things that we should be looking at other ways to do it too. But I want to see first how the congestion pricing goes, and then potentially looking to toll all the East River bridges.
You mentioned on one of your slides that in the past 6 years, public transportation use had been reduced and automobile transport was increased. And I was wondering, is there any insight into why that?
Well, rideshare is a big part of that. Rideshare doesn't account for all of it, because if you think about it, $2.75 on the subway, last time I checked, Uber costs a heck of a lot more than that. So it's not the whole piece of the story. But people are frustrated with our MTA. The MTA, first of all, is the original sin of Robert Moses. It only comes into existence because Governor Rockefeller, wants to take Moses out of power and uses the MTA to consolidate the bus and rail system, and the system's been really deficient since then. There's some conversation about the city taking over the MTA so we can have local control. Sounds great. The problem is there's $40 billion of debt on the books of the MTA that we would then be on the hook for, and not the rest of New York State. So there's problems with that proposal. But we have to fund properly the MTA. That's why I was very disappointed with the resignation of Andy Byford, because he was doing the right things and doing them well. And unfortunately, he ran into someone named Andrew Cuomo who didn't like the headlines. And we had a Giuliani-Bratton situation of similar sorts, and it's a real loss. Yeah.
So I appreciate your enthusiasm for bicycles, but as a walker, I am afraid of bicycles more than cars. And I didn't see any place for walkers on Central Park West.
So I did want to have the sidewalk expanded, and I'm a 20,000 steps guy day, so I walk everywhere. And I have it documented on my watch. But I will tell you that I think walking this city is a magnificent experience that, my wife and I we just walked to work together the other day. And yes, so I think that's part of the solution too. But I think that also, listen, with bicyclists, enforce, you don't want people going the wrong, just like you don't want cars going the wrong way, bicyclists shouldn't go the wrong way either. But that's why I also support 2-lane bike lanes, so they don't have that desire to go in just one way. So I think if we move there, we can make the city walkable, livable, bikeable, and we don't have to put the car on this sort of artificial pedestal anymore. It just becomes one of the many transportation options we have out there. David.
This is wonderful, Jason. Thank you again for
I have to keep up with your playing, it's hard to follow you.
I'm not at that level. But I have a question. So I think someone who hasn't lived here in the city, my city in Manhattan, mostly Brooklyn, Queens, and New Jersey, as we have the conversations, and I understand that you have taken that into consideration in proposing using less cars. But how do you envision the commute of people who live in Brooklyn and work in Queens?
Yeah.
And you will know there is no public transportation. They
Yes.
have to take a car, it takes a long time if they go by public transportation. Or people from New Jersey, how do you coordinate or how do you envision creating alternatives for people
So
not to drive?
one great way to get from Queens to Brooklyn that I've been toying around with, I'm talking to a few elected officials about it, is to create what I call Jane's Way, which would be a dedicated bike highway and walking highway, free of cars 100%, to traverse Brooklyn and Queens.
Let's do it.
There we go. All right. So if we start thinking about that kind, I mean, that's just like, no one's thinking, but they're doing it in China right now, and it's very popular. They're doing it in Oslo too. When I was there, I saw a bikeway that they had. And so, if we think like that, we can do it. As far as folks from New Jersey go who aren't paying New York City taxes, we're going to make the mass transit system very much better for them, and that would be the best way for them to go. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This has been great.